And the next speaker is Eetu Sipilä from the Helsinki with the title Tools for Thinking, an overview of methods of philosophy.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. Thank you for the organizers kindly letting me speak. Might be the last time they make a mistake like that. The topic is based, or my talk is based around the paper I'm writing on the tools of thinking, an overview of methods of philosophy. It is both an entirely ambitionless and ambitious paper at the same time, but mainly consists of two main ideas, and I'm trying to, or two main sections maybe, and I've been trying to convey them throughout the presentation today. So let's see if I can. So in a proper Kierkegaardian style, I will start with a warning to the esteemed listeners for today that the following lines of argument are likely to seem somewhat obvious or maybe obviously false to you. This, however, I justify in light of certain clarity, something we will return to later. And of course, even in the case of such a wonderful epistemic virtue as clarity, there can be too much of a good thing, that is oversimplification. So we will see how it goes. So why another overview? It's no coincidence that I chose this particular painting, favorite painting of mine to this one. And of course, even though the smoke there conceals some of the valleys in the picture, I think the analogy is pretty self-evident. So my main motivation is that in most of the surveys done in regards to methodology of philosophy, there's vast prevalence and focus on the various schools and traditions. Quite often the list goes something like, well, here's the analytical school of philosophy and its various methods. Here is the hermeneutic school and its various methods, and then there's thinking or thought experiments. And it seems to be in a little bit of a disarray, and this is somewhat annoying and angering, and I'm seeking to unify and to rectify this relatively simple, almost a sort of librarian issue. Then on the other hand, there is the question of methodological plurality, not necessarily pluralism, but we'll discuss the distinction later, of the seemingly contradictory modi of doing philosophy. So, in short, the sort of loftier goals for my idea would be the sort of unification of this list, possibly even working on the idea of convergence in regards to the topic of this conference, of course, and at the very least to gain some clarity or insight to the question at hand. So, as we have already discussed today at length, at the excellent presentation here in regards to pluralism, there is an evident empirical plurality that is quite powerful in the field of philosophical methodology. So the obvious examples would be, again, the analytical philosophy against, say, hermeneutic school and their somewhat contradictory approaches. So if we take the sort of weak approach, we can only discuss this in context of plurality. So it's evident that there are these different methodologies, but also we can take a stronger approach of pluralism and say, well, maybe there's something to each of these methods respectively. A weak form of meta-convergence might be found from certain complementarity. This was already referenced at an excellent earlier talk, of course, so that it might be the case that the different types of philosophies or different types of methodologies of philosophy might be complementary in some sense, just like in case of physics, you might have quantum phenomena explaining the very small scale of things, and then on the other hand, sort of general relativity and cosmological models explaining the larger picture. So there might be something similar going on in philosophy as well. Then there is the question of methods versus methodologies. So this is also quite annoying. We have quite often in the surveys, we have these thought experiments and analogies, and then on the other hand, we might have Kantian method. which is obviously much wider thing than a particular way or operation of thinking. So in an attempt to unify this conversation, I am more interested in methods than methodologies rather as sets of methods. I take from Dieu the sort of lower order reading of methodology in contrast to higher order reading. The higher order reading to methodology would be something more akin to the distinction between sciences and philosophy. So philosophy is something between humanities and natural sciences, or it's not either or, but it's something completely different. I'm not particularly interested in that, but rather I'm interested in the actual methods, and I would argue, in sort of a attempt to make dialogue with the previous presentation, that it is indeed, in regards to the very methods of philosophy, more than its object, that we find distinction between philosophy and other sciences, or should I even say sciences. So I suggest this problem-based approach. The main idea is relatively simple. Methods are tools, and in this framework, I simply seek to simplify and unify at least the way that these methods are listed and treated. However, there is a stronger implication in this method, of course, because by rendering these methods in a quite pragmatic way as tools, there is a strong functionalist sense. However, I attempt to do this in a very forgiving way. So some tools might be bad, but that's okay. So I'm not necessarily saying that any particular set of tools is objectively better. So of course there might be a functionalist approach that is very much in line with the logical positivist movement, and then it would sort of render inane and absolutely useless all other tools. But the functionalist approach is more of a description of why they are used rather than as a normative prescription of if it's a good idea. And on the other hand, the motivation to do this is to improve understanding, so that hopefully some fruitful intersections in philosophical work itself, and maybe even across boundaries, can be made. So we go to the sort of first sub philosophers have problems, hopefully less accurate and toxic as this particular one. I put it to you now with very little evidence, but with great confidence, that the aim of philosophy is clarity. By clarity, I mean some excellent combination of understanding, truth, knowledge, wisdom in context of thinking. This is not to be confused with simplicity. And the aim is not synonymous with purpose. So the purpose of philosophy might be more tied to its domain. Say some philosophers in this sort of Aristotelian virtue ethics tradition might argue that the sort of purpose of philosophy is to make flourishing and excellent and virtuous human beings, whereas a philosopher of mathematician might be arguing for some attempt to find infinitely eternal Platonic truth or something like that. So this is the line I'm taking, and this is not, however, out of thin air, in the sense that these catchwords, understanding, truth, knowledge, and wisdom, are actually the top picks in the recent field survey for the aims of philosophy or for the purpose of philosophy. I have omitted, of course, happiness and justice and things like that, because I find that they are more akin to the domain of that particular study and not another. But it's that simply to say that there are quite a lot of philosophers who think that yes, indeed, understanding truth and knowledge is something to look at, but I will not reduce clarity to any one of these, which of course is a hot topic for debate later on. So then again, in an equally provocative manner, I put it to you that all philosophical problems relate to clarity in some sense, which is of course a relatively modest claim regarding to our definition of clarity, but I'm not claiming that they can all be reduced to questions of clarity, so this must not be understood in some early Wittgensteinian approach. However, philosophical methods are indeed tools to solve those problems, and they relate to clarity. So, for example, one of the examples I gave earlier, in case of analogy or thought experiments, they are clearly there to help communicate some idea or to explore some intuitions further, and this is to seek some clarity in regards to, say, the truth of the matter or understanding your own principles or intuitions, say. Pluralism, on the other hand, if we want to go there, is indeed explained by instrumentality. So different tools different tools are sort of needed for different types of tasks. So this would make it sort of evident that why we have this plurality, and we could also maybe justify pluralism in this regard, but we don't have to do it. You can say that the difference between the tools is the difference between a saw and an electric saw. So you don't have to go to pluralism in order to accept this line of argument. See, the analogy is doing a lot of work in this presentation. So a very obvious tension here, of course, is quite evident. Well, there are these different traditions in philosophy, and there is also the tension to try and separate from the tradition, as famously sort of not a direct quote from Aristotle, but obviously he wrote in Greek, but it's also in sort of a reference to Aristotle that Plato is my friend, but an even greater friend to me is truth. There are these attempts to clarify the issue of philosophy. So interestingly, or earlier today, of course, Plato himself explained this tripartite Socratic method that I would rather call Socratic methodology, but that is not important right now. It could, I'm simply making the point here that it could be restated as a sort of operation to get to the bottom of things in a clear manner, that is, to clarify the issues at hand. I will not linger here any longer. We come to the sort of the more maybe social aspect of this question. So obviously there are historical and social reasons why certain methods are applied. So as you know, we know from scientometry that philosophy is one of the most incestuous sciences or academic disciplines there are, along with mathematics. So what your teachers do very hardly determines what you do, and also how much you can publish and things like that. So obviously these types of social reasons are heavily influencing what methodologies people apply, but I suppose there is this sort of master and apprentice type of thing going on there. The tool analogy again works pretty well. And the emphasis on different aspects of clarity also vary. So there is truth versus understanding. So quite often we have, and this is something we will discuss in the conference as well, later in the following days, that there is quite often the sort of tug of war between truth and understanding. An interesting side note could be made to the Aristotelian notion of endoxa, but I don't think we have time. So framework does not obviously mean relativism, simply means function over allegiance. Interesting analogies could be made. Scalpels as saws. Very bad idea usually, or very ineffective. But screwdrivers quite often work as hammers. So obviously there might be different ways to apply these tools. Then there is another, maybe more provocative idea that we could follow, moving from identity to craft. So indeed, if these are only tools, then we should be less interested in who we are as philosophers and why are we following this particular tradition and this particular line of thinking, but rather actually trying to solve the problem with the available tools. Well, that was the sort of motivational part. So we move to the second part. All right, wonderful. So we'll move into this is something that will be more thoroughly explored in the paper, but I think it's worth exploring here. So there is a method to this madness, I suppose, and this is the sort of line of thinking that I'm envisioning. I'm here giving just a handout of examples of what I sort of seek to do here. These are not written out, so these are obviously there's a lot of variance. So for example, just based on Inkeri's presentation already, we could say that the conceptual analysis on explication could be separated into multiple parts that can do a lot of work. But here we can see that the different aspects of clarity are sort of mainly addressed. Obviously, these are oversimplifications in a sense, but this is the sort of idea that I'm aiming at. It would be, I think, fruitful for at least people approaching from outside of philosophy, which I suppose includes me as well, to make it more approachable in the sense that these tools are well defined and methodologies are rather used as examples or typical historical domains of when these were used. Just like in physics, we would give examples of certain important problems that certain mathematical tools were used, or certain experiments, and so on and so forth. So, does it all converge? Well, I suppose not necessarily, but feasibly this approach can help build some bridges, so that's not bad. Is this just Wittgenstein? Well, it's obviously influenced heavily by Wittgenstein, but there are obvious differences. I mean, some more erudite and learned members here can tell, I think, all about that. But at least one good example is that the boundaries of philosophy are quite lenient here. A really good point of argument here is that this is not rigorous enough, which is fair, but philosophy itself is very hard to justify rigorously. Clarity is contextual and unfortunately also quite unclear. However, self-referentially, the current rendition, as seen in this presentation, can be seen as somewhat of a dull knife. All right, I think that concludes the presentation. I'm looking forward to the comments and questions. Thank you.
Right, so let's have it here. Eetu, let's have you first.
There you go.
Okay, thanks. I enjoyed the talk very much, and I'm actually interested in whether certain philosophical methods are complementary. And I like the way that you combine all the methods into some larger philosophical methodology, and you used complementarity and compared it to the scientific complementarity, which is very interesting, and this is what I'm trying to do. But if you take Bohr's complementarity, then the same system must have different views that are mutually exclusive. And this mutual exclusiveness makes it harder to just put everything together. As a matter of fact, you can argue that things are a little less than what they seem if you embrace this point versus hidden variable approach. So and by the way, one of the things that I suspect is complementary, but I haven't been able to prove it, is David Chalmers' meta problem versus his hard problem. And there might be something like that there, but it needs more work. But again, thank you.
Yes, thank you for that comment. I think it's very true, especially if we take the sort of mathematical definition of complementarity and thus sort of requiring mutual exclusivity. Then indeed, as we find that there is a lot of overlap in these methods, it makes it more difficult for sure. However, there is also the sort of less rigorous sense of complementarity in the sense that they complement each other, meaning that for example, in approximation, we could sort of think of different models that approximate partially the same, but also partially different areas of the geometric. Yeah, well, yeah, supplementary. I think it could work there. Yes, thank you.
We have a question there at the back, and then.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk first. Well, I just have like a counterexample for this view. And for instance, I think that mostly when philosophers build philosophy as something that is epistemic in nature, we have a problem with accommodating ancient skepticism, because ancient skepticism has a practical aim, and the method is to destroy our epistemic goods. So how you can accommodate that in your framework?
Yes, that is an excellent question, especially in regards to my sort of personal history. My first interest or my first love in philosophy, I suppose, was ancient skepticism. So I have certain sympathy for the question. And now I'm not necessarily stating that for each and every philosophical question, all the methods that we would need to be able to apply all the methods at the same time to the same extent. I suppose that you could even argue that these tools used by ancient skeptics are indeed tools that are very difficult to use and indeed very difficult to actually make use of. And this framework would, in that case, rather explain and try to motivate them by their function and not necessarily try and justify their use in modern epistemic contexts.
Then we have Lauris now.
Yes, I'd like to ask about your distinction between methods and methodologies. These methods are these kind of bags of different kinds of philosophical tools or toolboxes, and these kind of methods are these kind of methodologies are bigger kind of critical projects, like, for example, ancient skepticism or Kantianism or things like that. I just kind of wonder if you can have one without the other. This is the kind of big question, because what you seem to have is an account of methods without a kind of overarching view of what is the task of philosophy. And in order to have that, you have to have some kind of problem, because all of these critical theories, like, say, Kantianism or Wittgensteinianism and so on, they have had some kind of view of what is the kind of main problem of philosophy. And if you don't go that ambitious, then you at least have to have some kind of, say, philosophical paradigm that kind of identifies the kind of how you approach certain problems, and that those kind of use as well, to use Hintikka's terms, as strategic rules for applying these models, or Kuhn's terms, paradigms. Then there's kind of, I just kind of wonder if this kind of, you can classify or characterize or use these kind of methods without giving some kind of thick description of their use, to, so to say, through some kind of critical or constructive philosophical program.
Thank you, Lauri. That is indeed a very good question. Now, I think that the sort of one of the underlying motivations behind this talk or this paper is that I think that there is no end to the supply of surveys of methodologies of philosophy that go over them in these traditions and schools. So this is rather more of a functionalist approach. Now, to the question of whether these can be separated, or if I can give an account indeed without these larger constructive projects, I suppose it is indeed possible, but then it is not then again to give an account of these different traditions and schools, but to rather see what different actual methods have been used in actual philosophical problem solving by these schools, and lay out the tools, maybe even with some historical examples, and then ask, what is your cathedral that you want to build with these tools? So there is the historical account, how these Kantian wonderful buildings were erected in this sort of architectural analogy. However, I think that this is the question of how to apply these tools in modern context, or another way to sort of sort them out rather than the tradition. But thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much.